Good evening, everyone. I'm Vanessa Perry, and I'm Associate Dean for Graduate Programs at the George Washington School of Business. On behalf of the School of Business, on behalf of the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration, and on behalf of the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis in the Business School, I want to welcome you all, and in particular, I want to thank the National Association of Realtors and Realtor.com for choosing us. We're not the only university with George in the title in town, but by George, we're the best university with George in the title in town. So with that, I'd like to introduce our dean from the business school, Dean Linda Livingstone.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and to welcome you to this really interesting discussion that we have before us, focusing on millennials and the housing market. And this topic, I think, is particularly interesting for us here at GW. We obviously are in the process of educating a lot of millennials in all of our schools at the university. As many of you may know, GW is, I think, the second largest landowner, real estate owner in the city of Washington, D.C., behind the federal government. So we care a lot about real estate and what's happening there. And then, as Vanessa mentioned, we have a Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis that does a lot of research looking at what's happening with urban centers and walkable urban spaces, which obviously has a lot to do with millennials and what millennials are thinking about how they live and where they live. So this is a very appropriate topic for us this evening to be discussing. And we are honored to have with us this evening Julián Castro, United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Jonathan Smoke, Chief Economist for Realtor.com, and Nick Timiraos, Economics Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Millennials make up about 27% of the U.S. population, and despite their reputation as a very transient generation, they make up the largest share of home buyers at 32% right now. Even more striking, millennials now constitute 68% of first-time home buyers. That percentage might soon grow even more. A recent survey found that just under half of millennials will be looking to buy their first home over the next 2 years. So obviously a very important and timely conversation for us to have this evening. Millennials will be the next great U.S. generation, and they have lots of questions to ask about housing. So we're glad to be here this evening so that those questions can be answered. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Nick Timiraos of the Wall Street Journal, who will moderate our panel discussion this evening.
Thanks so much. Thank you. All right, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome, and thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. You know, when we talk about millennials in business, there are a lot of generalizations a lot of the time, and I think that's a mistake because it's really hard to generalize, of course, about such a large cohort. But I'm really looking forward to getting into the discussion, and so thank you for joining. Thank you online for participating. If you have questions tonight, please submit them through social media, through Twitter. We have the hashtag #HousingForMe, or if you're here in the room, definitely I encourage you to fill out a card earlier in the program, pass it back, and then we'll try to get to those later on. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome our panelists tonight. Our first is Secretary Julián Castro, who was sworn in last year as the 16th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. He oversees the agency's $46 billion budget, its 8,000 employees. Before that, of course, he was the mayor of the city of San Antonio, Texas. He's been on Time Magazine's 40 Under 40 list of rising stars in U.S. politics and the World Economic Forum's list of young global leaders. So please extend a warm welcome to Secretary Castro. Thank you so much, Secretary. Thanks for joining us this evening. And then next, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Smoke, who is the Chief Economist for Realtor.com, the online real estate listings portal. Jonathan has spent over 20 years in the real estate industry, and in his role as Chief Economist, he analyzes and forecasts the leading demographic and local real estate demand trends. So Jonathan, please welcome Jonathan out tonight. Thank you both for joining us. So to get started here, Dean Livingstone went over some of the highlights on millennials, but Jonathan, before we go to the questions that were submitted earlier via social media, why don't you give us a primer on millennials? Who are these people and what is so special about them?
Well, Dean Livingstone gave us a good introduction. They're important because they're huge. They were born from the years, and we're using the definition to be consistent tonight that I think most demographers use, although there are some variations, from 1981 to 2000. That produces a number of about 87 million. And so sorry to any boomers out there watching us, they outnumber you by 8 million. So in pure numbers, it makes complete sense that we're not talking about the future with this generation. They are the present and the future, I would argue. She mentioned there were 32% of home buyers last year. They actually also represented 15% of sellers last year. So they're already a significant force in the real estate world. But their most common thread today, besides some of the challenges that I know we're going to get into, are that 40% of them, only 40% own a home, 60% are renting. And so affordability and some of the challenges that come from that and how do they get to the home ownership journey is a real important part of their experience.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Secretary Castro, I'm going to use the social media prompt for our first question, and it comes from Twitter user @Let'sGoSkatePool, who commented that the absurd mortgage rules make it very difficult for the average first-time homebuyer. And so, Secretary Castro, obviously the Federal Housing Administration, which is a part of HUD, has played a really important role providing credit during the downturn. And I wonder if you could walk us through maybe a way to look at this question. Geez, it's so difficult to get a mortgage. What steps has the FHA taken to improve access to credit over the past couple of years?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, Nick. And let me thank Dean Perry and Dean Livingstone and Jonathan and Realtor.com and all of y'all here at GW for hosting us. So the FHA, that is under the purview of HUD, for its 80-year life has been integral to creating housing opportunity for folks, especially for first-time home buyers. And that's as true today as it ever has been. Of course, the nation just came out of a significant housing crisis. And so at FHA, the concern has been to make sure that we learn the lessons of the past so that we don't slide back to where we were before, but at the same time, ensure that we offer a great opportunity for responsible folks to be able to own a home. And to that end, we've kind of done two things. One of them that addresses affordability, and then a set of things that address access to credit. In terms of affordability, in January, the President announced a reduction to the mortgage insurance premium. So the insurance premium, the annual insurance premium that folks have to pay when their loan gets insured by the FHA. And we estimate that that's going to save the average borrower about $900 a year. So you start to think about it, for folks who are responsible but of modest means, that can be a significant savings. Secondly, in May of 2014, FHA announced what it called a blueprint for access to credit, a series of steps that it was taking to work with lenders to provide them more business certainty to ensure that, well, the point is that they would open up their credit box a little bit. Because what we see, and what the Twitter question may really be asking, is that if it was true that a few years ago it was too easy to get a home loan, the story of the last couple of years has been that for middle-class folks, whether they're a first-time home buyer or not, responsible folks, it has been too difficult to get a home loan. So the question is, how do we maintain the safeguards that we have in place, but also open up the credit box so that more folks, including millennials, who, as it was mentioned, represent 68% of first-time home buyers, how do they get a chance to own a home? And both on the affordability side and on the access to credit side, FHA is trying to do some good things.
And Nick, I'll pat you on the back so you don't have to do it yourself. The impact almost immediately changed the market this year. I believe the fee change occurred on January 26th, And we're in
You have a good memory.
We're in the era of big data, right? And research, and we saw on an almost overnight 30% change in the market share of folks that were using FHA. So you now see a very close second to conventional mortgages, millennials getting about 37% of this year's mortgages through September with FHA. And why is that? I think there's 3 data points that speak up to the appropriate opening of the credit box. Number one, the average FICO score for all mortgages to millennials was 714 so far this year, but through the FHA, the average is 682. Now, that may sound like a very minor increase, but that's an enormous difference in order to open up that tier of folks who have less than perfect credit. Number two, the average down payment for a millennial is 7% on their mortgage so far this year, but on the FHA, the average is 4%. And if we polled this audience, anybody who's planning on buying a home anytime soon, chances are they will tell you that their number one issue is the down payment. And then finally, it also opened up the qualification, because even though the requirements for conventional and other types of mortgages say that you can have a debt-to-income ratio as high as 43%, the overlays, the effect of the overlays make it that the average debt-to-income for a millennial this year is 36%. So when you get into the topic of student debt and how that adds to their overall debt payments relative to their income, the fact that the FHA average is 40% opens up an enormous difference. And 4% is big. Just like that minor change of $900 on the fee made a significant impact to the folks that it made sense to get this mortgage.
And to make sure that I think everybody who may not be aware, because you hear a lot of times you need 20% down to get a home. And you hear, oh, well, after the crisis, it became much harder to get a loan, you need 20% down. That, Jonathan, actually isn't true and hasn't been throughout the crisis because of the FHA, right?
That is right. And now, soon after, you're actually before the FHA change, Fannie and Freddie both introduced lower down payment programs requiring just 3%.
Right.
But if you look at the qualification metrics for who's getting those mortgages, they have even higher FICO scores. So it's like, okay, the down payment is an issue, but you need to be perfect in every other category to be able to get that. But no question, it's a misnomer to say it takes 20% down. Now, am I talking to you like my child or my niece or nephew? Then, I can say it's always best to put 20% down. And mathematically, the people who put 20% down are most likely to get approved and most likely to get a slightly better rate. But technically, historically, we've had options for less than 20% down. My first home bought 20 years ago was with 10% down. So there have been options for many years, but that's part of the mission of FHA that I think was woefully needed, and even more so today when you think of these other debts that millennials are carrying.
And so the way I think it works with FHA, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that because you're putting down as low as a 3.5% down payment to compensate taxpayers for the risk, because it's really the government that's standing behind the mortgage in the event of a default, you're paying an insurance fee every month and also up front when you take out the mortgage, and that kind of creates a reserve fund. So Secretary Castro, at the beginning of the year, the president announces the cut in that fee. And this is the time of year where the FHA does its kind of annual financials. I wonder under what conditions would we see perhaps another decrease in that insurance fee?
It's a good question. Of course, we just lowered it in January, and the answer to that is that we're always going to be sensitive to ensure that we're pricing according to risk. And when we lowered the mortgage insurance premium in January, we had just gone through 5 increases in the MIP. And so we felt like, based on the numbers and where we were in terms of the actuarial review, that it makes sense. And we don't have the 2015 report back yet, but we're hoping that with the increased volume, that the capital reserve ratio will have gone up significantly. As that happens, as the fund continues to get stronger, it'll allow us the opportunity to look at that again. But right now, we don't have any plans for another reduction.
So no news tonight.
That's right.
Don't make your plans around.
I told Nick my goal is not to make news.
Okay, and my goal is to make news, for the record. I guess the other question I have is we saw the FHA's market share get very large in 2009 when the private sector just ran away from risk. We saw the market share decline, as you noted, with those annual increases in the fee. How appropriate is the FHA's market share right now? And I'm kind of coming from the other lane for a minute from Let's Go Skate Pool's question, which is to say you hear critics out there saying, gee, we're making the mistakes from the bubble all over again with all of these low down payment mortgages. Should the FHA be doing even more to pull back from the market? How do you find that?
I believe that there is a strong balance right now. Of course, the FHA plays a counter-cyclical role. There was a time during that boom from 03 to 07 when I think our share of the purchase mortgage market was something about 2.5%. And at one point in 2009, it was closer to 28%. Today, we're closer to 15%. It is fulfilling its counter-cyclical role, and we're going to ensure that we take make the necessary adjustments so that it plays that healthy role in the market.
Thanks. So Jonathan, we'll go to the next question that we got from social media. It's from Twitter user @ASLP, who shared that he or she is very gun-shy about taking on a mortgage since the crash and a layoff long after the alleged recovery. And so to that point, I wonder if there are signs that millennials are less interested in homeownership than previous younger generations or generations at their age. Have their attitudes towards buying a home changed, or are we seeing lower participation, lower homeownership rates that are simply a story of their incapacity because of lower incomes and higher student debt?
Well, this is my favorite topic, so I pay attention to every survey, everything that purports to say this is what millennials think. And survey after survey reinforces the perspective that millennials are more positive about the outlook for the country. They are, in fact, the only demographic that thinks we're moving in the right direction. Number two, they have a positive view of the economy and their own conditions getting better. More so than others. And number three, they do believe in homeownership and the real estate, and their interest in real estate is astounding. This year we've monitored where somewhere between 65 and 70% of adult millennials looked at real estate online in any given month. Now, a lot of that is just following what the Property Brothers just did. Some of it's looking at pretty pictures, some of it's trying to plan the escape from mom and dad's basement. Some of it is a very real issue today, is figuring out just how much your rent's going to be jacked up at the end of your lease. So it's a full spectrum of the interest in it. But I would characterize what I see in here like this. And it's basically, we believe in homeownership. And long term, I see myself owning a home. My problem is in the short term, I can't see my direct path there because I have these other challenges that are impacting me. And so the story, the request, it sounded like that one had an unfortunate year. The math would tell us that more so than any age group in 2014 and 2015, because about 30 to 40% of the jobs created have gone to millennials over the last 2 years. So their situation, it's so 2012 to say these folks are down on their luck and stuck with mom and dad. But there's 87 million of them. So you're going to have people who are out of their luck in a particular year and people who are winning. But just to frame, I think about half of this year's growth in sales is coming from first-time buyers. And when you do the math, it essentially translates into 2% of this generation will have bought a home this year. We don't need
how does that compare to last
all of
year?
them to be successful.
How much of because we're seeing a decent year for home sales here, how much of that would you attribute to first-time buyers being more active?
Oh, about half the growth that we saw over last year. And it's that growth that's made this year a very good year. And that's why I think the change with the FHA premium was an instrumental catalyst to that. It's kind of hard to do the counterfactual and say what would it have been without it. But there's no question it's been part of the scenario that's helped to produce that. But our survey data indicates that the number one reason the millennials who got into the housing market this year did so because they'd had an increase in income, 35% of them. So we know that job story is rippling through that sector. And again, it's just 2%. Well, we've got another 98% that's left to get those opportunities and have that position. But to do so, they got to be able to save money for a down payment. They have to be able to deal with their student debts, and they have to be able to deal with their alternative to owning, which is renting, which looks all the more unattractive these days.
Right, and I guess, to the question of renting and the I guess the viability of that option, Secretary Castro, we have a question from another Twitter question. Janet Lou 91 asks, down payment and credit score are stopping me from buying. What should I do? I guess, do we run a risk of pushing homeownership too much here for people who don't feel ready to buy? What options does HUD have in the way of counseling or other steps to help, who help folks who they maybe aren't ready?
Well, one of the good news stories over the last several years is a stronger investment that has been made in housing counseling. In fact, we work with 2,400 agencies out there that provide housing counseling, including counseling for folks to help them understand the obligations and responsibilities that go along with home ownership and how they can prepare themselves for home ownership. And so I would invite anyone to visit our website, HUD.gov, and we have resources there available and can connect them with housing counselors.
You talked a little bit earlier about overlays, and let's break that down a little bit for people who don't follow mortgages on a day-to-day basis. This is the practice by which banks that have grown concerned that maybe they'll have to eat part of the loss on a loan that they thought had been sold to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or insured by the FHA, decide, okay, we're going to, even though the FHA will accept loans down to 580 credit score with a 3.5% down payment, we're going to say no one below 660, 640 credit score. And so I wonder, to what degree are those still a problem? How much confidence do you have that as you put more of the rules of the road out there, as you discussed before, that the FHA will actually encourage lenders to lend within the strike zone, but not create an even tighter strike zone?
I'm confident that the work we're doing with our Blueprint for Access to Credit is going to help. Whether it's the defect taxonomy, our single-family handbook, what we call our supplemental performance metric that more accurately gauges lenders against others who are lending in the same credit score range, or the loan certs that we're currently working on. We just went through this housing crisis. We also have had litigation that the Justice Department and some of these lenders have been involved in, and I think some of the comments that you've seen out there have reflected their response to that, and perhaps the overlays as well have been related to it. But the work that FHA is doing is foundational work to ensure that, again, we keep safeguards in place so we don't slide backward, but we also open up the credit box so that folks who are responsible are able to get access to credit. And for me, it's important because we talk a lot about income inequality right now in the United States, and that is a significant issue that people on both sides of the political aisle are proposing policies to address. However, maybe the more impactful story is about a wealth gap that exists in the United States. And generation after generation, the primary vehicle to create wealth in our country has been through home ownership. And today, we have the lowest home ownership rate that we've had in 48 years. And so, we don't need to go back to where we were before, but we do need to have sensible, strong policies in place that offer good opportunity for responsible borrowers.
So one view I hear a lot is that, well, the home ownership rate is now, if you use some of the census numbers, no higher than it was 45 or 48 years ago. Therefore, all of the federal policy we've had, all the support for home ownership has been a mistake. I'm guessing you disagree with that view. I guess I'd ask, what would you say to those people who say, well, mortgage interest reduction, federal subsidies for home loans, maybe we got it all wrong? What are those people missing?
Well, I think what they're missing is, first of all, the stability that home ownership provides to families to the individual, to families, and as a former mayor, I'll say also to communities, to neighborhoods on the ground. They're also missing this function that in the United States, that homeownership has provided for one generation to hand over to the next, that opportunity and that wealth. And let me just say also that particularly for folks of modest means and for minority communities, this is an even bigger deal because traditionally minority communities have not had the same homeownership rates, and lending right now to African Americans and Hispanics is a 13 to 14-year low. That's a cause for concern when those demographics are growing rapidly, and more our economy is going to depend upon those demographics to propel the nation forward. So whether it's the mortgage interest deduction or other policies, those are always going to be up for debate, particularly as the Congress in the future looks at tax reform. But I do believe that there's a strong argument for championing homeownership when it's done responsibly.
And Jonathan, I mean, part of what I should have said there, I mean, is that the homeownership rate doesn't take into account that we had this large demographic bulge with the baby boom. So we housed the baby boom generation, and the homeownership rate could have gone down, and it didn't. I mean, what else are we maybe overlooking, or is that the right frame to take? That say, well, maybe it's time to change, what we've been doing.
Well, I'll let you in on a secret. Economists like to pretend they know what the right level of everything is. Like unemployment and other things that actually have no real solid foundation for what is normal. Homeownership's the same way. We go through cycles of homeownership because of the demographics, and you're absolutely right that the period that we're referring to, back to when it was we're now lower, was actually the period before the boomers started coming through. So they had more success, and ironically had success in an environment that saw double-digit interest rates. So something is wrong with the path to homeownership, and it's multiple areas that need improvement. But I would totally agree that it's fundamental. If you're concerned about income inequality, then you cannot avoid addressing the housing issue, because the lack of affordable housing on the rental side leads to further and further damage in that there's no wealth creation, there's no ability to climb the social ladder, and then you have no path to produce wealth. And I would argue, when you try to compare us to other countries from a homeownership, well, another argument that camp likes to throw is that this was a failed experiment because our homeownership rate is no better than some of these other countries in Europe. Well, those other countries don't have the full range of income differences that we do.
And they have a much larger social safety net.
And they have a fixed infrastructure that controls the rent costs, which is almost completely absent, barring a few cities in this country. So it's not a fair comparison. But I thought the original question and something the Secretary said struck me as also important to bring up with regards to credit scores and how that relates to this generation. We focused a lot on the metrics loosening a bit, but I would argue that one of the fundamental issues for younger households today is the fact that we're still using a credit score process and standard that was essentially defined when many of them weren't alive yet. And so as a result, it's a traditional form of credit that ignores the things that they are paying on a consistent basis. And so somebody might not have history, but they've been paying their rent every month. They've been paying their cell phone bill. They've been paying their utilities. But that doesn't count in the FICO 4 standard that's behind the metrics today. So there's a problem with documentation on that really needs to catch up to the 21st century. And also, I would argue, income is an issue. I've heard this generation as the sharing generation, right? How many of you do something with like Lyft or Uber or Airbnb? Another way to describe that is the 1099 generation. But guess what? Any income you're making from that, not going to go to your mortgage qualification because you don't have 3 years of consistent history with that. And there's some issues that affect mortgage qualification, but have an enormous impact on young people today because of the demographics of that generation.
One of the other challenges I hear about a lot in having reported on the housing market for the past few years, and this is a question from Facebook, how can I buy when there's nothing affordable where I live? You know, a couple years ago we heard a lot of concerns about tight credit. Now more and more of the concerns I hear are about lack of choice, lack of good inventory. And so I guess, Jonathan, where are millennials going to buy if you have more boomers who are retiring in place? They're not selling their, you know, their ranch home, their single-family home in the suburbs, and you have low construction right now from home builders.
Yeah, there's no question supply is an issue, and the lack of new construction is a big part of that. Just to frame it for you, we have produced, how many people would say you agree that we don't have enough housing options, particularly affordable housing options, either on the rental or the ownership side? All right, I can attest to the audience online that was virtually the room. Well, so we're already in a hole, we already have a deficit, but this year we will have created about half of the new housing units needed to keep up with the households that have formed. So we're digging an even bigger hole. And so you have to, now why is that the case? Well, there's all kinds of issues at every level of government. So Secretary Castro can't solve most, if any, of them, because some of them relate to local issues around zoning and the processing around entitling and developing land. Then there are issues that have to do with the size of, for example, the low-income housing tax credits to help support affordable housing. And then there are additional issues that were a sort of negative byproduct of the regulation that went into effect because of the housing crisis that effectively have killed community lending on the construction side of things. So you've sort of handicapped builders and developers from helping to solve the issue. So supply is a problem. However, to the question of there's nothing affordable, this is where I'll put my hat on as potentially like your aunt and uncle. Believe it or not, I am old enough to have many of you in the audience as at least a niece or a nephew. And I can attest to the fact that our affordability today, actually on the existing home market, is really strong. There's a metric that NAR, the National Association of Realtors, puts out every month called the Affordability Index. And it's one of the simplest indices you can learn about because it actually means something. The most current index was 157 in August, and that means that the median income household in the U.S. can exactly afford 157% of the median existing price home. And even in the most expensive market in the country, we estimate about 9% of our inventory is affordable in those places. Guess where? In the Bay Area. But nationally, about half of the 1.9 million homes we have on Realtor.com are affordable by the standard of the median income household. And the history for that metric is also another lesson that you haven't missed your opportunity. If you were kind of born too late to have hit the stride to buy in the last couple of years. Today it's 157. The historical 44-year average is 125. And to your parents that were alive through 1979 to 1986, the index was under 100 that entire time. And in 1981, before even MTV was created, the index hit its all-time low at 64. So we've seen far worse.
17% mortgage rates probably had something to do with that.
We've seen far worse, and you literally can afford a home. Now, it might take voting with your feet and deciding that, okay, maybe DuPont Circle is not right for me. But
we were talking about Texas and how that was part of the reason so many people
Texas used to be
Texas.
a great state for affordability, but the growth there has so outstripped. Traditionally, as a builder there or a developer there, you could always start a new unit because there was hardly any restrictions on growth. But even there are limits to how quickly the builders can address this issue.
Well, and Secretary Castro, I want to ask you about, I mean, we have this picture of a house up here, but a lot of millennials, their first house may not look like that. It may look more like
a smaller.
An urban condo. And I wonder, you know, there's some people who say, well, is there anything more that the FHA can do to improve the loan application process for condos? Because condos are, in a sense, the starter home for you know, today's entry-level home buyer.
Indeed. And you know, every time I meet with realtors or other folks, I hear about condo rule that we need to get done.
This is where you can make news tonight.
Yes. Well, I have said before that that is on our agenda during this term, and so our folks are working on that. And we anticipate, you know, rulemaking process And we'll look forward, hopefully, to that being a positive contribution to open up home ownership opportunities. So, it's definitely on our radar screen, and it's something our folks are excited to work on.
I'll take a couple questions we got from the audience. They won't surprise you. We also got a lot of these on social media. Tuitions and student loan debt keep rising. How will that impact home ownership in the future, and what are Congress and the President doing about it?
Then the President has made a series of proposals that I believe will help with student loan debt, both in terms of putting policies in place that make student loan debt more affordable, and also a proposal to make the first 2 years of community college free, which in the long run would both help ensure that more Americans are able to get a good higher education and end up lowering student loan debt. With regard to housing, of course, as Jonathan mentioned, when we look at debt-to-income ratios, for instance, student loan debt can be very impactful there. The research is surprisingly inconclusive about how much student loan debt impacts home ownership, but it's safe to say that it can't help when folks have very significant student loan debt. And one of the other challenges is particularly with the significant number of students who start college, and oftentimes, you have a range of colleges from reputable to less reputable, but who may start an institution, take out loans, get saddled with that debt, and then not actually get a degree. That is fairly common, and I'm sure that folks have friends or relatives who have had this experience. All y'all here at GW, a very reputable institution. But that does have a significant impact on the ability of somebody to take out a home loan. So the President has been has shown real leadership in terms of addressing student loans. There's more that we can do. But the fact is that a lot of folks find themselves in a situation where they can't take on much more because of their student debt.
Well, and Jonathan, I wonder, so does this end up being the sort of thing that permanently drags on home ownership, or is it something that could delay home ownership in the sense that if you're going to college and you're taking on debt, but you're going to have a job that improves your income at the end of the day, that means maybe you're buying a home when you're 35 instead of 30 or 30 instead of 25. If, as Secretary Castro outlined, you're taking on debt, you're not finishing a degree, maybe you're not boosting your income prospect, we want to be really worried about that. So how much do you see this as a deferral or a drag on home ownership?
I think if it were just the student loan debt alone, and that's the only issue facing the generation, and everybody fit the average, then we likely wouldn't see a major problem. Because when we look at this year's successful borrowers, they had additional debts. And I agree, it's really hard to get these statistics and figure out what exactly the implication is. But it appears that about the average millennial today that successfully has bought a home so far in 2015 has had student loan debt somewhere in the range that amounted to a $400 to $600 a month payment. And that's well within the range, because if you think about the math to qualify, 43% is the threshold debt to income for a qualified mortgage. So think of that as your upper end. You never want to go above that. And if I can encourage you to go lower, shoot for 35. But let's use 43 as the ultimate qualification. And the loan to income max is 28. That leaves you 15% for other debts. But the problems are where you've got those debts saddling you down and you don't get the additional income benefit that an education would have provided you. You have additional debts on top of that. So the student loan itself might not have been a problem, but if you added a new car and $3,000 or $4,000 in credit card debt from your senior year into the mix, that could kind of further complicate things. And of course, all the combinations of those factors together, I think, are absolutely slowing down the pace at which these folks can do it. But ultimately, the real problem, I believe, is affordable housing on the rental side. Because the simple math nationally says that the median household is now having to spend 30% of their income to rent a home. And so if you've got 10 to 15% in student loan debt, 30%, you have no cushion whatsoever left to deal with anything else, let alone save for a down payment. So I think it's those two issues combined. There's no simple solution for anyone, but let's hope venues like this encourage more of a dialogue. I hear you have a word in with a certain strong presidential candidate. Maybe she too can tackle it.
You mean the next president?
Yes. Hey, I grew up in Arkansas. I know that well.
The last question we have is what can colleges do to increase fiscal literacy for graduates as they enter into their first jobs? It's a question that doesn't have us come up directly in a housing sense, but Secretary Castro, are there ways in which these kind of broader economic literacy issues can help address some of the housing challenges we face?
Well, absolutely, and I think there's opportunity for that at every level, certainly at the collegiate level, but my hope is that folks would get exposed to some of this before you get to college. I remember when my brother Joaquin and I went to college, we went to Stanford, and we were 18 years old, and probably within a month, we had signed up for American Express credit cards. And I swear, I think it took me about 15 years to pay that off. And I know that that happens to college students over and over. And so what we really need is a system of American education that sees financial literacy as just as important as any other subject. And that's especially true where the rules of the road are as they are today, and you need to navigate in a smart way. So at HUD, as I mentioned earlier, we invest in housing counseling, and that reaches a whole bunch of Americans. But the best way to ensure that everybody is better informed is to integrate it into our public education system at every level, including in higher education, whether it's public or private.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed the discussion this evening, gentlemen. Secretary Castro and Jonathan, thank you so much. And we're going to have Dr. Perry come on out for a few concluding remarks here.
Great. Join me in giving these gentlemen a round of applause. Really awesome. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Secretary Castro. Thank you all for being here. Tweet about it. Share. Go watch yourself on Realtor.com. But actually, there's lots of other information that you can access if you visit Realtor.com/townhall. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you.